Le Musée des f.p.c, or the Museum of Free People of Color, is a house museum on historic Esplanade Avenue in New Orleans, which had the largest population of free people of color in the nation prior to the Civil War. That's why Le Musée is dedicated to preserving and sharing the history of free people of African descent. Recently, Le Musée was the site of a lecture by Tulane University's Dr. Emily Clark that forces all to question the beliefs and ideas that have wedged their way into the stories used to explain how most free people of African descent acquired freedom and even their wealth. Relying on her research, Dr. Clark tells that while the system of European men keeping free women of color as mistresses and acknowledging and freeing the children born to their relationships existed, more common were free people of African descent who bought their own freedom, amassed their own wealth, and existed in their own marriages or lifelong relationships with other free people of color. And as Dr. Clark research tells, in many cases, when free women of color were involved with European men, it was not as mistresses of white men who had legitimate white families, but it was in open, lifelong relationships that were acknowledged by church and notarial
one
records.
Of the things that really struck me as a New Orleanian, especially after Katrina, was the stories that people told about New Orleans that I didn't recognize as being about New Orleans. And so I put aside the book project I was working on and decided I would go back and, starting with the Sacramento records, just investigate marriage and family life among people of African descent in New Orleans. I didn't know what I would find, but I suspected it would be different from what I had read in history books. Here we go. So let's see if we can get this up. There we go. I call this talk Family Geographies because it's inspired by this man. He's a French historian named Michel de Certeau. And he wrote a wonderful book called The Practice of Everyday Life. And one of the things that he said was that if we really want to know what the past was like, we can't just read the things that were written by officials and travelers to places. We have to somehow put ourselves down on the ground with the people who were living in the past and try to walk in their shoes. And so that's essentially what he's saying in this passage. We want to find out what people in New Orleans were doing at street level. If we're good historians, that's what we want to do. Now, he's speaking metaphorically, but I actually took him at his word and decided I would try to figure out what was happening at the street level in New Orleans. And we have a wonderful tool for doing that. It's called the Vieux Carré Survey. And I know that you have here a bound section from it that shows all the free people of color who owned property in the Vieux Carré. It shows the title going all the way back to the founding of the city. And with that tool, you can actually map who owned what piece of property, how they got that property, who lived there if you put it together with the census, and you can really begin to build up a sense of what life was like at street level in New Orleans in the 18th and early 19th century. And y'all know New Orleans is a small town now. It was really a small town then. And so sometimes when I read history and people act as though people didn't know this person or that person and they didn't know their family went this way and that way, I just roll my eyes. Because this was a very small town. And people knew. They passed one another on the street every day. They lived next to each other. So it's a really useful exercise to go to the Vieux Carré survey. Now, free people of color have been subjected probably more than any other group in New Orleans to the view from what I call 30,000 feet, right? Tonight, what I'm going to try to do is take us down to the street, and I invite you to go there with me. And you probably have been there longer than I have. That is, you know these stories from a different perspective. What I'm going to share with you is how I uncovered these stories with the tools that a historian uses. And I'd love to know whether you think I'm getting it right or wrong, and what I'm missing, and all those kinds of things. So let's have this next slide. This is how people imagine free families of color in New Orleans when they read the histories that have been written. If they go to Wikipedia and they Google free people of color, this is the image that it conjures. And so you have, especially, this is the Spanish free family of color, imagined. Imagined. Okay. So you have this white man in the middle, and he has taken a free woman of color as his mistress, and they have children, and the daughters of that relationship, well, they do the same as their mother, and they find their own white man, and then the daughters of that relationship, and so on and so on, okay? And then the same man at some point says, oh, I've sown my wild oats, that's it. I'm going to get married to a white woman. And so there she is over on the right, and he has a white family. So we're presented with this portrait of a tragic portrait, a family form that repeats and repeats and repeats. Free women of color and their daughters are caught in this repetitive cycle. And this is the reality as it has been presented. And I'm not telling you anything you don't already know, right? But I just want to be sure that, to confirm that this is the reality that's been presented in history books. Let's go to the next slide. Here's Wikipedia. And this is what it says. When you Google free people of color and New Orleans, this is the first thing that comes up. How many of you have done this and seen it? Okay. So this is the first thing that comes up, and I want you to notice a couple of things about what it's saying, because even though real historians don't consult Wikipedia, most Americans do. And if somebody is coming to visit New Orleans from another place and they get curious about free people of color, this is the first thing they're going to see, okay? So notice, I've done in blue, concubines. It's very loaded language here. And it's explained as a matter of demography, right? That the reason there's so many free people of color, there were so many free people of color in New Orleans, was because there were very few European women, and so European men formed relationships with women of African descent, and it was a simple matter of demographics. And the free people of color were the children of these relationships. That is actually the explanation that is given for the growth of free people of color, not only in New Orleans, but in Haiti and in other parts of the Caribbean. The reality, and you already know this, I know, is different. In Haiti, the reason there were so many free people of color was because its economy was booming and people were able to buy their freedom because things were so good in pre-revolutionary Haiti. The reason in New Orleans was basically because of Spanish law. As you probably know, during the French period, if you wanted to free someone, or if you were an enslaved person and you wanted to purchase your freedom, it was very hard to do. You literally had to go before the equivalent of the legislature, the Louisiana Superior Council. The Spanish came in, and it was much easier. You could just go to a notary and have a notarial act drawn up. You guys know this, right? Or you had the right to self-purchase. And if your owner didn't want to sell you your freedom for a fair price, you could sue them. You could take them to court, and those cases usually prevailed. Okay? So the reality is that actually more people came to freedom through self-purchase than through any other means. So it wasn't about the children of guilty white fathers freeing their children. It was really much more that the path to freedom was self-purchase. And that was also in part because towards the end of the 18th century, New Orleans too began to be a more prosperous place. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So there's the law, the Spanish law, that made all of this possible. Scholars have to show you the law. Now we'll go to the next one. And this is just to remind you. Now we'll go to the next one. Harriet Martineau was an English sociologist. She was an abolitionist, so her heart was in the right place. She took a tour of the United States in the early 1830s, spent most of her time in Boston, but came to New Orleans for a few days, and she interviewed people in New Orleans. She didn't interview any free people of color, she interviewed white ladies. And this is what white ladies told her. That the quadroon girls of New Orleans are brought up by their mothers to be what they have been, the mistresses of white gentlemen. Every young man early selects one, and establishes her in one of those pretty and peculiar houses, whole rows of which may be seen on the ramparts, that is Rampart Street. So, nearly everything in this quote is wrong. I could spend hours talking about all the things that are wrong, but I'm just going to focus on one thing.
All right.
And that is those pretty and peculiar houses on Rampart Street. Right? Whole rows of them. It's like that entire end of town was like Sin City, you know, and you could go there if you wanted to have a look. You could go. That's the implication that she's giving, you know. So the Vieux-Carré survey actually allows us to check on whether or not that was true. We can actually look at who owned property on Rampart Street and how they got it. So let's just take a look at a few sample blocks here. Square 106, which is the second from the right. During the Spanish period, 18th century, most of the property facing Rampart Street, and this square was no exception, was owned by a European man, Jean-Baptiste Conrad. Other parcels were owned by the widow of François Cournant de Villiers. She passed her property on to Charles Jumonville de Villiers. Let's have the next slide. I'm just going to take you on a little tour. Okay, so there you go. There were no owners of African descent, not until late in the antebellum period. Now moving uptown, let's go to the next square, which is square 104, which is the fourth from the right. Okay, let's go to the next slide, because then you can look at that and not listen to me. Most of that property was owned by a white widow named Marie Suzanne Cowie-Pelou. And until the Civil War, many other white widows bought and sold lots along this block of Rampart Street. There was one free woman of color who owned property on this block before the Civil War. So, it was Madeline Wilkes. Madeline Wilkes was married to a free man of color named Jean-Baptiste Blaise. So we still haven't found the place. Square 101, middle left, half block. This is an important block. Let me point to it. It's this little block right here. And if Freddie Williams were here, she'd say, oh, that's right across from Congo Square. Okay, it is. It's a small block. It's bounded by Rampart, St. Peter, Burgundy, and Orleans. At the close of the Spanish colonial period, all but 3 of the 21 lots in the square, so out of 21 lots, 18 were owned by free women of color. They almost had a complete monopoly on this block across from Congo Square. And not a single one of these women on Rampart Street was set up in her property by a white man. So I'm going to give you the story of the women and how they got their property, because I think the story of Square 101 is on the one hand remarkable because of what it tells us about what's not true, but also because it points to what we would probably find in other parts of the city if every one of you in this audience went and did this research.